It was a cold, foggy evening in the small town of Willowbrook. The streets were quiet, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Inside the grand dining room of the old Hawthorne Manor, a group of 6 people sat around a long polished table. The room was lit by the warm glow of a chandelier, and the air was thick with tension. At the head of the table sat Mr. Reginald Hawthorne, a wealthy and respected businessman. To his right was his wife, Mrs. Eleanor Hawthorne, a graceful woman with a sharp tongue. Across from her sat their son, Victor, a young man with a troubled past. Next to Victor was his fiancée, Clara, a kind-hearted woman who seemed out of place in the tense atmosphere. Completing the group were 2 guests, Dr. Samuel Grayson, the family physician, and Miss Beatrice Lane, a close friend of the family. The occasion was a dinner to celebrate Victor and Clara's upcoming wedding. The table was set with fine china, silverware, and a lavish spread of food. But as the meal progressed, something felt off. Halfway through the main course, Mrs. Hawthorne suddenly clutched her throat and gasped for air. Her face turned pale, and she slumped forward onto the table. Chaos erupted as Dr. Grayson rushed to her side, but it was too late. Mrs. Hawthorne was dead. The local police were called, but they were baffled. There were no signs of forced entry, and no one had seen anything unusual. The only clue was the half-empty plate of food in front of Mrs. Hawthorne. It seemed she had been poisoned. Enter Detective Arthur Lane, a sharp-minded investigator known for solving the most puzzling cases. He was also the older brother of Miss Beatrice Lane, who had been present at the dinner. Detective Lane arrived at Hawthorne Manor the next morning, determined to uncover the truth. He began by questioning everyone who had been at the table. Mr. Hawthorne claimed he had no idea who would want to harm his wife. Victor, visibly shaken, insisted he loved his mother and would never hurt her. Clara, though distraught, seemed genuine in her grief. Dr. Grayson admitted he had access to various medicines and poisons, but denied any involvement. Miss Beatrice, however, seemed unusually calm and composed. Detective Lane examined the dining room carefully. He noticed that Mrs. Hawthorne's plate had been slightly chipped on the edge, as if someone had tampered with it. He also found a small, almost invisible scratch on her wineglass. As he dug deeper, Detective Lane discovered that Mrs. Hawthorne had been secretly writing a will, planning to disinherit Victor due to his reckless behavior. This gave Victor a strong motive. But there was more. Dr. Grayson had been in debt and had recently borrowed a large sum of money from Mr. Hawthorne. If Mrs. Hawthorne's death led to Mr. Hawthorne's decline, the debt might be forgiven. Miss Beatrice, on the other hand, had always been jealous of Mrs. Hawthorne's influence over her brother, Detective Lane. She had also been seen arguing with Mrs. Hawthorne the day before the dinner. The pieces of the puzzle began to come together. Detective Lane realized that the poison had not been in the food or the wine, but on the edge of Mrs. Hawthorne's plate. She had accidentally ingested it when she cut her food. The scratch on the wineglass was a red herring, meant to mislead the investigation. Confronting the suspects, Detective Lane revealed the truth. Miss Beatrice had poisoned the plate, hoping to frame Victor and remove Mrs. Hawthorne from her life. She had used her knowledge of poisons, gained from her brother's old case files, to carry out the crime. In the end, Miss Beatrice confessed, her calm demeanor breaking into tears. She was arrested, and justice was served. Detective Lane left Hawthorne Manor, the fog lifting as the sun rose over Willowbrook. The poisoned plate became one of his most famous cases, a reminder that even in the most elegant settings, darkness can lurk.